you might be doing Agile, but are you actually being responsive to what you learn?
Okay, welcome to Retrospective Agile, or should I say Agile Retrospectives, podcast where we look at Agile retrospectively. I'm Dan Suciu.
I'm Bogdan Mureșan.
And today we have a special treat for our listeners. And because our guest doesn't speak Romanian, we are switching gears and doing this episode entirely in English. Joining us is Cliff Hazell. Cliff is an expert in organizational development with a 2-decade career tearing down obstacles to excellence in companies around the world. With his work on coaching Spotify teams and co-founding the Flight Levels Academy, Cliff brings a lot of knowledge and experience to our conversation. Welcome, Cliff. We are excited to have you here.
Excellent. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Cliff, it's obvious that you bring up a wealth of experience to the table. And before we dive deeper into our discussion, would you please share with our listeners a bit more about yourself? We'd love to hear about your journey and what led you to your current role in coaching and organizational development.
Yeah, sure. So my career starts, I guess, somewhere in product management originally. And I've moved around and done a bunch of things over different periods, but mostly it's been around helping companies be more effective as they're building products and services and so on. A lot of the time I spent working in telecoms. I've done a bunch of stuff in fintech. I've worked with high-tech startups. I've even recently dabbled a little bit in healthcare and some interesting things in that space. But yeah, started out in South Africa doing a bunch of things and found my way to Spotify in Sweden in around 2015 or so, 2014 actually. And yeah, joined the company when things were going a little bit crazy and really starting to take off. So I think I was just a little bit before the 700th employee. And 5 years later, when I was starting out on my own and doing what I do now, when I was leaving the company, we were just over 5,000 people. So pretty crazy growth curve. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stories from Spotify. There's a lot of stuff from the product management space. There's a lot of interesting stuff from the work that I've been doing since, mostly in the space of coaching leaders and helping them to design better organizations. But yeah, let's not give it all away in the introduction. We'll say just a few things and then I'll kick it back to you and see. Hopefully that gives a little bit of a sense of what I've been doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this, let's say, insightful introduction. And considering that in a month and a half, specifically in 28th of March, isn't it? You will be a keynote speaker here in Cluj-Napoca at the Agile Mammoths Games conference. And I don't know if you know, but the first editions of this conference were called Even Mammoths Can Be Agile. And given your expertise in addressing challenges encountered when scaling companies, we were thinking of starting directly with one interesting question. In your opinion, are mammoths capable of true agility? You know, many large companies claim to be agile, but do you think they truly embody the agile mindset, or is it often just a surface level implementation?
Yeah, so is it possible? The short answer I would say is yes. Is it common? The short answer I would say is no. I think that there's a bunch of reasons why that is, but perhaps the main one is that most commonly once a company is moving and is quite large, I think it was Einstein that said something about an object in motion tends to stay in motion. And basically what happens is that the direction that the company is moving in tends to continue. And it's quite hard to turn something that is quite huge, large, and has a lot of energy going in this direction. I think there's several layers to that. So one is that there is kind of the cultural change of kind of shifting from the current ways of working maybe to a more adaptive, iterative, incremental, agile approach, if you will. So there's that sort of cultural shift. And the other bit is that actually to turn any part of the organization in an agile manner, like once you're actually iterating in an agile manner, I think can be tricky as well, because most of the ways that organizations are used to thinking tends to be a little bit more like, well, we make a plan and then we just go execute it. And I think partly it's sort of a human nature thing. When you're young and starting out, you sort of have this feeling, hey, maybe I don't know all the answers, maybe I should experiment and try stuff. Once the company is making, hundreds of thousands, or even maybe more than that, millions, billions, there's quite a strong idea that we know what we're doing. And to some extent, that's true. And I think that makes sense. I mean, you're clearly not failing as a company when you're making lots and lots of money. So who are these people to tell us that we should do it differently? I guess the challenge, of course, is that things somehow change in the environment around. Technology shifts, ways of working shifts. Recently we've had things like COVID, and there's sort of a trend of becoming maybe more remote or asynchronous in how we work. Currently, big things, AI, certainly likely to shake up a bunch of things, historically to that, mobile phones and the internet and all of this stuff, if we go back further in history. These things change the environment and make new things possible that weren't possible before. And I think there's a certain tendency to try to maybe scare some of the execs at some of these big companies. Well, if you don't change, you'll eventually go out of business. Sure, but you're not the first person to say that message. And so I think there is a little bit of perhaps even healthy skepticism to some of the ideas that go on in that space. And so I have a little bit of empathy for folks in that space, because I have led companies a couple of times myself, and there's always somebody who thinks that they know the right answer and that we're doing things wrong, and if we just listen to them, it would all be magic and ponies. But on the other hand, we do also need to change and adapt. And so I think there's a lot of interesting questions we could unpack about, why and how and when do we change versus when do we, sort of have this conviction that we're going the right way and doing the right things. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's easy to have the right answers until the moment that you have to take a decision. Then the right answer is not that obvious anymore. And also, it's very interesting what you said, because I have seen the same. Like, it depends a lot of the perspective from where you see if the company, like the Mammoth, it's agile or not. Like, if you're asking some exec, it's like, oh yeah, we are very agile. We switch from with 3 degrees, which for a company on our size, it's huge. It's very hard to change like that much. If you ask somebody from a team, it's like, oh, we cannot test ideas that we have soon enough. We have many dependencies that basically are colliding, and we cannot solve the things as we are used to do. And when we are a small startup, for example. So it's like if we would think like exactly from these two perspectives, like if somebody from a small team would ask you, like, if you would have one thing to say, yes, this big company it's agile, and because of this ingredient, what would be that ingredient which you would consider that it makes the Mammoth agile?
I think one of the things that a lot of people forget, and I see this with big companies when they've been operating for a while, is that there's sort of this idea that there is one operating model or one way of working that will kind of apply everywhere. I don't think that really makes a lot of sense. And the reason I think that is that different parts of your product and services, some of your internal ways of working, internal processes, all of these kind of things, they're going to be at different stages of their product lifecycle. Some things are new and emerging. Other things we know exactly what to do, and we just need to run them every month. We know how to do invoicing and billing, probably. We know how to hire people, these kind of things. We don't necessarily have to be doing as much adaptation and innovation in that space. And I think basically what I would say when I see a company is being effectively agile, the question is more about where are they being agile than are they being agile just per se. If they're using it in the right places, something maybe where we're trying to discover something, be innovative, figure out a new product, launch something, something where there is something more to learn at a high level of learning. So a very, very high quantity of new things that we could learn. If we're maybe in the middle trying to convert something we know it works and we're just trying to scale it, maybe some sort of agile approaches, but I might be looking maybe more at some sort of things like lean, these kind of approaches, removing the defects, making things more stable, consistent, that kind of thing. And if we go all the way across the other side, maybe high-end manufacturing or, scaling out for huge volumes, these kind of things. So much more in the commodity product space, widely adopted already. Probably there's some other methods and approaches, sort of trying to get to the point of zero defects, even more efficiency, and less really about, does it work? We know it works. We just need to make it cost less or be more consistent. And so, I mean, it's maybe an oversimplification to use just those three buckets, but I think companies that do this stuff well are really able to understand where to use the tools and not just using one size fits all across the entire thing, whether it's agile or even maybe a more traditional kind of approach.
Love the answer, because I've been asked similar things many times, many times, and it's always when you find an example like, oh, you're doing very good there, yes, but there are other 5 things that are not working in the same area, but they do not need to be exactly the same everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Cool, thanks.
And I think it's also important to understand that agility is not a binary concept. You are or you are not agile. You are agile at a certain level, and you continue to improve this thing. It's a transition, actually. You will never reach that point where you say, now we are done. We are agile. Everything is set. Everything is okay.
Yeah, I do though. I think that there's a couple of things that are maybe quite common that you can say, well, if we're able to do these kind of things, then it makes sense that we could call ourselves, somewhat responsive, or we have some level of agility. A common one that I think a lot of people talk about is just the sheer quantity of things that companies are trying to do at the same time. And, in the agile space, we talk about things like limiting WIP or using some kind of a sprint or something like that to kind of constrain and create some focus around a few things. But most companies do something like this, whether they're doing, quarterly or yearly. They have some kind of, we take a bite and we say we're going to try to do this stuff by the end of the quarter, the end of the year, something like that. The challenge that I find is that most of the time what it is that it's much more of a let's lock in the plan and stick to it, rather than let's experiment and find sort of a good path towards it. And so I think it kind of makes sense if we're going to actually change our plans and adapt to what we learn. But if we're going to ignore all the things that we come up with and discover along the way, I would say, you might be doing agile, but are you actually being responsive to what you learn? Not so much. So maybe in that sense, you could judge, do you actually make changes based on what you learn inside each increment or each iteration, each sprint, each month, each quarter, each year? If you're adapting your plan and you can say, okay, well, last time we did these things, we learned these things, and so now we're going to do these other things, or we're going to do it this way, or we're going to, change something. But a lot of companies just don't do that. And so I kind of wonder a little bit, well, what's the point in using Agile in those kind of spaces if you're not actually going to change? Like this huge, expensive change program to try to transform the entire business, and you're still not going to listen to anything that anybody discovers inside a sprint or inside the quarter. That to me seems a bit strange. So I look for that, like how fast are you actually changing, or how often do you actually respond to new information versus the plan is just executed?
I was thinking to the fact that most of the time, most of these big companies, they start with introducing agility at the teams level. Now we have some teams which are agile, but we didn't change too much at the company level, at the business level. And also, if I remember well, I think I read in Klaus Leopold's book something about the fact that you have to start with the leaders or with the upper management. But they are not available for trainings and workshops. They don't think they need to be there. They think that all these things, all these workshops are only for the other employees. How can we get them? How can we make them aware that they are very important in this process?
Yeah, I sometimes joke and say that this is one space where change should actually happen top down, in that the people at the top should go first. And I think what happens in these situations is very often the language that I hear people talking in a lot of large circles of the Agile community is very anti-management and very dismissive of what senior leadership do. I don't know about you, but if you talk to somebody who disagrees with you before you've even met them, the likelihood that you want to have a conversation with them and listen to their ideas, I think it's quite small. I think what we need to do is actually model the behavior of listening to and having some empathy for the responsibilities and the needs of people in the broader business. One thing that I am often quite critical of Agile in general, and I say Agile as if it's sort of a giant blob of people, but like a lot of people I've heard kind of being like, oh, well, it's all about making people happy, and oh, it's all about discovering the new things. Like, sure, those are all nice to have things, but at the end of the day, your CEO is probably not going to support an initiative that doesn't change the business metrics in some meaningful way. So how are you going to connect it to the business metrics? You've got options. There's time to market. There's things like potentially profitability. There's even things like, innovation and actually discovering new products and services. And I think very often if you talk to the senior leadership, you talk to folks like your CFO, you talk to folks like the CEO, the chief product officer, you can start to understand what are the pain points that they're feeling and not just say, okay, cool, well, we'll do exactly what you said, but at least take that into account when you're trying to explain and pitch and talk about the changes and improvements that you want to make. And I think that Flight Levels specifically gives a number of different ways for folks to talk about that with senior execs. I find that a lot of the time, if I'm talking about things as sort of, metaphors and language that kind of connect to the whole organization, it's not about the team being agile. The metaphor that we often use is one of typing a letter, right? Each team pushes a key on the keyboard, essentially, because we've organized ourselves as specialist teams. We only do a part of the work. And so what we actually need to do is not just have that team push the key as fast as possible. To write a letter for the customer, what we need is the right team pushing the right key at the right time, which is a totally different sort of an approach. And I think that this changes not just what the senior leadership will resonate with, it actually also changes what folks inside the teams would think about doing. Because I'm not trying to ask, Bondan, can you type as fast as possible, please? Write your code as quickly as you possibly can. I don't really care about how fast you write the code unless it is somehow the bottleneck on our overall delivery. And it's very rarely the case. Usually we're waiting, weeks or months between some sort of analysis and the actual software development. And we wait even some more weeks or months between when we actually deploy it. The marketing campaigns run on a different cycle. Sales and sign up are again on a different cycle. And the reality is that the end to end of that is quite a long period of time. And so what we want to try to do is shorten that full end to end loop all the way from the idea to the actual thing being in production. And that's something that I think often resonates a lot more with senior leadership than, let's do better estimation or let's be more predictable in the team. I don't care how predictable the team is. If the company as a whole is not communicating and coordinating, you're not going to produce any of the letters that your customers are asking for anyway. So let's actually solve the sort of higher order problem rather than, keeping everybody who's already very busy even more busy with a new change in a way of working. Very often, if we just simplify and streamline and make clear what is important above the team level, suddenly we start to see improvements in a different way.
Yeah, for this, I blame it a little on the Scrum, on the Scrum framework or methodology, because Scrum talks a lot only about very small execution. It's like it was a small team, a small project, when in reality, we end up scaling a lot of the times with many teams, with many departments involved. With we got to have like sales and marketing and coordination between 10, 15 teams, and it's very interesting because yes, it's a two-way street. Like also the teams need to be aware that everything needs to be coordinated. And there is a strategy which involves this. And since you mentioned also the flight levels, I would say like you have worked with tons of companies, and how often do you meet teams which, for example, are not aware that there is an entire world above the team, which is trying to, like you said, to write the right letter to the customer, not just pressing some keys on the keyboard.
Yeah, I think it's quite uncommon that people are very aware of what's happening outside of their immediate space. And I'm not really sure where I would kind of point, like in terms of responsibility for this, because I think it's a lot of different factors that play a role in creating this. We've created things like departmental silos. So, product and engineering sits separately from the marketing and sales team, who again sit separate from each other. Finance sits maybe even in another building or another country, these kind of things. And so it's quite hard for me to get some sort of understanding when I have no interaction or proximity to those people. And when I do, I usually get a very detailed, very sort of like all the nuance and like everything is explained, all the metrics and KPIs. And it's like, okay, I don't actually need all of the information. What I need is some simple thing that can say, hey, this is actually how the business model works. We care about driving this thing and that thing. These are the implications that has in terms of, what you're doing. Here are the people that are dependent on your work maybe, and how some of the things connect. And I think very often we don't invest too much energy because most of the time leaders are spending their time managing the delivery rather than communicating and describing and clarifying things around strategy and connection and relationship, like sort of the purpose of what we're doing. And so I think a lot of people just haven't seen that. And so they've almost become used to not knowing why their stuff is happening. That they just kind of, we're just going to write the code and get on with it. And, let's not ask too many questions because if we do, people don't know the answers anyway. And so let's just get on with it. And I think it's hard because as the organization gets bigger, like this kind of thing happens and it evolves. Again, I would look to some extent at flight levels as an approach to trying to address some of this, because what I find is helpful is that we start to sort of paint a picture around you've heard of concepts like value stream mapping and these sort of things, to actually understand how does the customer come in and all of the different aspects that they use of the product, what are all the different interaction points? And if we create and design our organization a little bit more around trying to manage that flow rather than just, these people build software and those people do the invoicing, we actually start to see that, there's several things in the invoicing process that could be simplifying. If we did something during the sign-up flow, for example, or actually we're signing up customers that sound good when we talk about user activity metrics, but they're terrible when it comes to actually paying because those people don't tend to stay on and retain. So we spend $1,000 to acquire a customer, we make $100 in revenue from them, and they're gone before it's actually useful. And so in that case, that conversation is actually counterproductive, or that lack of conversation is counterproductive to the business. And so, yeah, I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all solution to that, but I think in many cases, it's a case of trying to map out what is the actual customer goal and how does that value get provided so that you can get people talking along that stream rather than just marketing and sales and finance and product talking as if they're like the only piece of the puzzle.
I just wanted to ask Cliff, sorry, Bogdan, because we mentioned about flight levels, and I think our listeners there are some listeners who might not be familiar with it.
Yeah, sure.
Can you explain a little bit the concept and how it helps in understanding and improving these organizational dynamics?
So for me, one of the hardest problems in organizational design is figuring out where to start solving problems. Because in almost every organization, there is no shortage of ideas. Everybody has ideas about what we should fix. But how do we decide which ones are going to have impact? Because there's more than we can focus on at any given time. And this is true both for the actual work, like the delivery work that we're doing, plus also for the change and improvement work and iterations and so on that we're doing. So for me, the metaphor of flight levels is helpful because it helps us to think of the organization as three different interacting levels of abstraction, if you will. So basically, if you think about it, you fly close to the ground, you see the detail, but what you don't see is you don't see very wide. You can't see very far. When you fly high, you see quite far into the distance. You can see over the top of the mountains, you get a long range view. but what you don't have is the detail. If we think about these two levels, one is operational on the ground, sort of the detail of whether it's hiring people, building software, this kind of thing. Could be financial reports. It could be anything that the company does. Even the CEO can be doing work that is actually on the ground kind of operational work. But we also have a strategy and we have a direction that we're trying to get to. And in the middle, we have this that I describe as coordination. And the idea here basically is that we're trying to not just connect each of these levels internally with each other, but we're actually trying to create some interaction both hierarchically, so up and down the hierarchy, so that information flows and connects. You know, I'm building this thing because it relates to that initiative and it connects to this strategy. We can actually see this not just in theory, we can see it actually in the day-to-day working of what we're doing. But the second piece is that often what I find is that inside an organization, we tend to, as you said, go towards those team level solutions. So we try to optimize and improve the performance of any individual team. But the reality is that because we don't have that coordination layer, we can't really see how things flow across the value stream from, you know, idea to actual being in production. And so what we're doing with level 2 is we're saying this team from marketing, that team from sales, this team from finance, this team from customer ops, and these 10 teams who build the software, they all need to work together to make this product work. So we're going to build a flight level 2 coordination system around these people so that we can have some conversations, interactions, make some decisions, communicate feedback, this kind of a thing, to actually align around the delivery of the things, you know, initiatives, projects, that kind of thing that flow through the system. I could carry on, but that's probably enough, at least for now. There's a lot more nuance behind it and many cool concepts once you start digging into it. But if you think of it roughly as like we're visualizing and coordinating work within this context of a team, very often we're doing this at the strategy level of the company to an extent as well, although there's often opportunity to improve that. Most of the time, what I'm finding I'm introducing is a cohesive and coherent set of value streams within the organization, building these coordination systems around the teams that need to collaborate.
I think it's worth to mention that here in Cluj, you will deliver a training on the second level.
Yes. So I'll be doing a talk during the conference. As you said, I'll be doing one of the keynote talks. And then I'm also running a workshop. I can't remember if it's before or after, but I'm here for a whole period. I think it's like 4 or 5 days. And yeah, we'll be doing a workshop as well. So for folks who are interested, you can sign up. I assume you'll put the link in the show notes and definitely people can reach out and find some information about it.
Okay. Sorry, I interrupted you. I don't know if you can continue your idea.
No problem. In fact, I can continue my idea because it relates also to what Cliff mentioned about the flight levels. If we still have some time, it's very interesting because like at the end of last year, I don't know why I read again the book Tipping Point of Malcolm Gladwell. Sometimes I want to detach from the agile world, from technical stuff. I read also stuff which is not related, but funny. It brings my mind still in the still in the work. And at one point, he describes the concept around Kanban number and how you build things around people at most 150. And the things which marked my mind was the peer pressure, the positive peer pressure, which it relates a lot to what you said. Like you need to talk with people from different with different specialization, different skills. You need to know who do you sell, why do you sell, why it's important to do that. And in my mind, a lot of the time, I saw it until then that the peer pressure is something like I'm saying something to you, and if I'm committing to you, it's like I'm creating this positive peer pressure, like I'm taking commitment, and I will be very ashamed if I don't do it. But Gladwell said something very interesting, that also the peer pressure brings something else, which means for me to understand, because we are discussing face to face and we have some relationship there, we understand what is your pain point. Why do you don't want to sell it to that customer? Why it's important for you to bring that feature at that time in the market? How it affects you as a person? Which for me it was like, whoa, it relates a lot to the things that I'm doing, even if I didn't anticipate that. And I thought that like we are trying to build these connections between everybody in the company, but where is the balance? Because if you are a scale up, if you're a big company, everybody's talking to everybody. The CEO comes to one of the teams and it's asking for something, and it mess up all the things that you are trying to do. But it needs to be a balance somewhere, and also from the levels you have just described, like is the strategy and the execution, the operational, and is the coordination. Every people are talking. How do you keep the balance on which you maintain this relationship, you understand the other problems, but also you keep some order there?
Yeah. So the way that I think about this is that a big part of what we're trying to do is get people talking about things at an appropriate time. I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting where you're just about to wrap up, you think everybody's agreed on something, and then somebody throws a new idea into the mix. This happens all the time in a company context, whether it's this team suddenly has a brainstorming session, or hey, we're just at a different part of our process. You guys are ready to ship the campaign, but we're still busy building the product. And so now things are evolving and changing. And it creates a lot of extra work for other people elsewhere in the organization. And so I don't want to go all the way to the other spectrum where we lock everything into a hard process with heavy stage gates and nothing can ever change either. But one of the best examples that I saw of this was one of my favorite managers during my time at Spotify. We were going through a lot of big changes, things like, opening a new office in London, for example. And I was working quite closely with the team that was responsible for this. And one of the things that she was really good at doing was saying, look, here is the process that we're going to use for this. So for the first N weeks, I'm going to be talking to everybody. We're going to have these sessions. We're going to have everything is open. We're exploring. We're looking at ideas, right? Maybe you've heard of something in design. They talk about the double diamond, right? So you explore the problem space and then you converge on a problem statement. And then you go again, but you now explore the solution space and you converge on a solution. I think very often in an organization, you can spell a little bit of this out at a meta level and say, look, here's where we're figuring out if this thing is a good idea to invest some time in. Then we take a decision and we say, okay, cool. Now we're going to spend 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 years, whatever, throwing some time and energy at it. And at the end of that point, we're going to say, do we continue or do we not, right? It's very similar to doing something like a sprint, but it's just at a sort of a zoomed out kind of a level. Now, once people know that, you can say to them, hey, we're actually in the point where we're trying to create less options. So you throwing more options into the mix is actually counterproductive right now. I know that you think that you might have the best idea, but the reality is that we already have 55 ideas. And so what we're trying to do is narrow it down. And so we can focus the conversations and rely on people's different special, well, I don't know really what I would call it, but special skills, basically. Some of us are more naturally going to see options. Some of us are more naturally going to see problems. And that is very, very helpful for shaping that conversation. And so when you spell it out a little bit and you say, look, we're doing this exploration and then we're going to narrow the list of projects down. And this is roughly when you can get involved. That gives people a space to know, oh, actually, my turn is coming up and I'm going to save my energy for that time. I'm going to let everybody else be involved now, or I'm going to get involved in an appropriate way. And I think that once you start to do this at each level of the organization, you're doing a little bit of the guys from 37 Signals, they talk about this idea of shaping. So you're kind of drawing a little bit of an outline, not necessarily hard details and everything, but it's roughly similar to setting constraints. And I think that partly defining some sort of at a loose level, a timeline, a sequence of events. This is where you can get involved. This is the point where it's too late to get involved because we will be moving forward. That kind of thing really helps people. And I think a lot of what we're doing with 5 levels is essentially giving people that at all 3 levels, but not just giving them that as in like, I tell you now, this is how we work. It's exposing it and making it explicit so that you could say, hey, I know that we're doing this thing over here, but would it make more sense if we moved it from this point to this point in the process, right? Or even, hey, I think this is how we're currently working. What do all of you think? And you go, I'm not sure. Actually, this bit, or you left this thing out, or, oh, I didn't realize we were doing that thing. Okay, cool. Now we've got a more common and shared understanding of how we're actually working. And we have something that we can kind of hold people a little bit to so that it's not just, chaos and randomness, which I think is a little bit of, certainly some of the earlier days when I was at Spotify, a lot of autonomy, a lot of freedom, but the really hard part is actually getting people to connect back to each other. And when it's great when the team can deliver everything within themselves, but as soon as you need somebody else's help, that's the point where we need to start connecting the dots and creating these kind of interfaces and conversations. Yeah.
I'm curious about something, because you created or co-founded Flight Levels Academy. You also are so familiar with a Spotify model. Let's call it that way. What about SAFe? Where are the common things between SAFe and how SAFe is, let's say, applied and useful for scaling organizations, and which are the differences between these models?
I think what I would do is I would draw back to what I was saying, or point back to what I was saying earlier about having sort of context appropriate approaches. And I think often what happens when I see people doing these large scale transformations, and I've seen people try to do this with Spotify, with SAFe, with Scrum. I've even seen people try to do it with Flight Levels. When you do a wholesale redesign of the organization upfront, without taking into account any of the people's sort of nuanced detail about, when I'm on the ground, this problem exists over here, but it doesn't over there. So a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work. I don't think that there's that many ideas inside the context of SAFe as a broad level that are problematic. But if you try to do all of them, that's problematic, because probably you don't have all of the problems that those things were designed to fix. And this is exactly the same as when I see people doing stuff with Spotify. There is also a huge amount of stuff that is left out of all of these descriptions. The actual human and psychological, like having some sort of empathy, dealing with the very individual part of the change journey of my fear that, hey, when you make that change, does that mean that I'm going to be out of a job in 6 months because it sounds like that team doesn't exist anymore? You see this in a lot of transformation programs, all the project managers going, well, what is my role? If the teams are managing all the work, what do I do? And I think that you have to address some of these concerns and fears that people have if you're going to kind of actually get people involved in things. So the biggest difference that I would say between what I consider to be effective approaches versus ineffective approaches, and I think this is almost regardless of what tool, method, or framework you're using, is Klaus has this quote. He says, we don't design flight level systems for people, we design them with people. And I think that this is the difference. When you get people working together to have a conversation, to agree some kind of, this is our team agreement, this is what our level 2 system looks like, this is our strategy, this is whatever it is, right? And I'm fully aware that you cannot necessarily have 100% of the people in your company involved in every single one of those conversations. And again, I would point back to that bit of like, where do people get to be involved? If you explain to them, hey, we are changing, we're on a journey, we're going from here to here. We don't know exactly where here is yet. It could be, sort of on the right side. It could be a little bit on the bottom. We're going to explore and see what happens. But basically, when we're starting out, we're going to go for 3 months and we're going to be focusing on making these kind of changes, improvements. What are your questions? And when people get to then say, well, I'm wondering about this, and what about that thing? I see it a lot with restructures. I've done almost exclusively collaborative reorganization with inside a company. And I don't mean, people tend to conflate reorganization with firing a bunch of people. That to me is a whole different thing that usually results from some mistake that the leadership made. But when you get to a certain point, you're like, this team is too big, we need to change the shape or the interactions between the teams. Maybe we should involve people outside of just the managers so that we don't only solve the managers' problems. Because we want to solve something a bit broader, and we would like to have people involved. We'd like to take into account the nuance. What does the other flight level think? How do we connect it to the problems that we're seeing and help people to get some context and, take into account what they're seeing? So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, because I think what you're trying to do is weigh them against each other. I don't really care so much. I'm almost totally agnostic about approaches. I've worked inside companies that are doing SAFe. I've worked with ones that are doing Scrum. I've worked with loads that are doing none of the above. And for me, flight levels is not something that kind of fits into the mix of these things. It's a totally different way of saying, hey, where do we start solving problems? And how do we think about the different interactions between the parts of the organization? It's not the same as safe. It's like saying, well, do you want a nice shower or do you want breakfast? They're not related to each other at all. Like, they're totally different things. You probably need a little bit of both. And I think iterating and experimenting, kind of taking a more approach of like, let's solve one problem first, see how that goes, and then let's look for what is the next one. That kind of approach makes more sense. And probably if you do that, it doesn't look exactly like the Spotify model or like the safe big diagram.
Yeah, you didn't only answer my question, but I also love your question, and I feel that I can stay tens of hours talking about these kind of things. They are very, very interesting. I hope that we will have a beer here in Cluj.
I do too.
And to talk
For sure we will.
It's one of my favorite things about being able to travel and come to events is like I get to meet people like yourself and we get to have a conversation. When we just do it online, I mean, we chat now and then, we'll say goodbye in a few minutes and then that's the end of it, unfortunately. But if we get to hang out, have a beer, have a dinner, something like this is good. I like that.
And I need to say that one question that you ask, it will stick in my mind. I love it. Where do we start to solve problems? It's I love the fact that sometimes a lot of the times asking the right questions, it produces much better results than giving like a solution or a straight answer. And this one will stick with me. Then I think that we are getting to to the end of the time.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so as we wrap up today's episode, we want to extend our thanks to Cliff Hazell for sharing his insights with us. Thank you. I'm Dan Suciu.
I'm Bogdan Mureșan.
And we hope you, our listeners, have found this conversation as enlightening as we have. Stay tuned for more episodes, and until next time, keep embracing the agile mindset and never stop learning. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.